The rigs to reef thing was interesting. Dana Larson, who I would consider the father of rigs to reefs, him and Billy Reggio, both those guys predated myself. I was out fishing and diving offshore, and I always used to dive on one of the rigs and didn't really pay much attention to what happened to the rigs after a while. I went out one day and a rig was gone, and I assumed that I was in the wrong place. My compass was off. I didn't have Loran at that time, so I figured maybe I made a compass error or something, and I just really couldn't figure that out as where that big old rig went to, because they're there, and I assumed they would be there forever. And then I found out, to my chagrin, that no, there was a federal act that once the rigs went in, that once they outlived their usefulness, the oil companies had to get rid of them. And I thought that was kind of strange, in that it was, if you ever dive the rigs and you ever do this, huge habitat underneath it, tremendous fishing. And it reminded me of a 1951 Jimmy Stewart movie, Thunder Bay. And if you ever go back and watch it, it was interesting, where the oil company was first going into Louisiana and putting up their rigs, and the shrimpers and the local Cajuns really didn't want the oil companies working out there. They thought it was bad omen and whatever, until they found that the oil companies were getting these huge shrimp at night, and and the whole story turned into a win-win for everybody. So Tenneco, I think, was the first one to donate a structure, and then they towed it over to Florida. And it got a big bunch of press, but it just never went anywhere in the country. They passed in 84, I guess it was finally. They passed the National Artificial Reef Act, ostensibly because of, I think, so a lot of work on the Tenneco rig turned out to be a tremendous reef for Florida. A lot of people didn't agree with that, but right now all the data is it was an awesome thing. But meanwhile, the rigs were taken in and scrapped, and we had a rigs to reef program here in Texas, but really Parks and Wildlife was not looking offshore at all. They didn't make their money offshore, and the heck with the divers and the heck with anybody else. So back in the early 80s, you had the oil companies primarily pushing the rigs to reef program, and they had to have a way to get rid of the liability. That was the main key. So they started doing some legislative action, but it's an oil company bill. And in Texas, to my chagrin at that time, I said, ooh, oil companies, Texas is oil, and man, they're lobbyists and everything, they'll get this thing through with a piece of cake. Well, it didn't happen. Didn't even get out of committee. And I said, boy, I didn't understand that, so I started really reading about things and getting into it. And finally, it's with the Bay Area Divers Dive Club and Texas Gulf Coast Council of Divers, and there were some guys that are very supportive of the Rigs to Reef program, and but they're mostly environmental people. Some of them work for oil companies, but really they just couldn't get anything done. Well, I work in a political arena, and I decided, this is terrible, because what's going to happen is, in so many years, I find out in 50 years, the platforms will be going offshore. Well, if I go out and fish on it now, and they're gone in my lifetime, where are the kids going to fish? So some of the rigs to reefs are primarily for habitat. Nice snapper habit, and snappers are basically supposedly in trouble in the Gulf, and the oil companies don't get enough credit for the rigs to reefs of really creating habitat for the snapper.
Right. Your interest in this came, though, primarily because you do scuba diving, and it was more a hobby than anything else. At the time, who was the company you were working for at the time?
West Gulf Maritime Association.
Okay, so you were actually in that position at the time. This all.
I was not a vice president. I was just assistant to the vice president at the time.
And was the MMS very helpful to you in this activity?
The MMS, Mr. Reggio was very helpful in that he was very pro artificial reefs. But I wouldn't say the MMS as a whole was very helpful at all.
Right.
And same with Parks and Wildlife.
I mean, there have been stories about the fact that people just about had their jobs on the line.
They did, from what I understand.
On this.
People, what was interesting is you read the history and what people were saying, 25 years ago. And the question, begs to differ. We started the program in Texas in '89. Since '89, the rig, what occurs is when an oil company basically donates a rig to us, and we either create the site right there, or they can tow it to one of our reef sites, which we already have, because we like to cluster and build not just small little reefs, but try to build some habitat and do a little designing there. And we're still in the infancy of the program. But if you could go back to, let's say, 1970, 10 years earlier, and let's say the program wasn't in effect, and a lot of people back then really were talking about that, but it wasn't embraced. I would say it wasn't embraced totally by the offshore industry because of liability problems and a whole bunch of other things. It wasn't embraced by government at all. And but originally they thought it was, because Tenneco rig turned out real positive, and spent a lot of money trying to do that. But then it just never caught on. But if when they put that rig down, if they just started the programs and got it, it would have been, say, in 10 years we've collected in the artificial reef program over $4 million.